Hey everybody, we're going to do our second video on organic molecules. You see our little cartoon here focused on nucleic acids, DNA. Yeah, we're going to touch on nucleic acids at the very end of this video. Before we do, let's talk about the other two organic molecules. We mentioned carbohydrates in the first video, so now let's move on to lipids. Lipids have lots of functions in the body, including cushioning and insulation and membrane functioning and hormones and steroids are part of that. We'll mention more specifically this one function, energy storage, in this video, but do understand that lipids have lots of roles. So you see here fats and red meats and margarine and butter. These are examples of foods that are relatively high in lipids. It's okay to eat foods that contain lipids. You have to have them in your diet, and we'll discuss why in just a moment. Before we get into that, let me clean up here. Before we get into that, let's mention, let me go back here. Lipids are important molecules, and it's a pretty diverse group. There's quite a few different kinds. If you ever hear the term fat or oil or even waxes like earwax, those are actually examples of lipids. And one thing that kind of binds this whole group together, because they are so diverse, is they're all hydrophobic, a term you've probably heard before, which means they don't mix with, they don't combine with water. So whenever you put oils or fats in water, they tend to separate or move away from the water. And that's because their chemical bonding, that we won't get too detailed with this, but their chemical bonding is such that they do not mix or combine with water very well, so they tend to be repelled by it in lots of ways. If you think about, like, you go through a place and you get a cup, what's on the inside of a cup? A waxy layer, and that's so the fluid will not go out and get into the paper part of the cup and make the cup fall apart. If you're like me and you keep a cup in your car and the car gets warm and the wax gets a little bit melty, then eventually the cup will break because the fluid is simply going to seep into the paper part of the cup and cause it to break. A little off topic. But anyway, let's keep going. So lipids are an important group, and they do have one role, and that we'll talk about here, which is energy storage. To see how they store energy, it's helpful to look at what a typical fat looks like, a fat molecule. And in this case, you see there's two parts to it. There's a glycerol part, and there's what are called the fatty acid chains. And there's three fatty acid chains here. You see them listed on these as yellow balls. If something has triglycerides, it has a bunch of molecules that are shaped like this, and it's almost, this E shape, where the E is the glycerol and the parts of the E are the fatty acids. So whenever you hear the term triglycerol, that refers to, or a triglyceride, it's a glycerol joined by three fatty acid molecules. So just like carbohydrates were made of combinations of, or a bunch of monosaccharides, fats are made up of glycerols and fatty acids. These are the building blocks to make a triglyceride. Why do I point this out? If you were to look at the chemical bonds represented by the yellow balls, let me go back a second. See the yellow balls here? The yellow balls are actually represented by, these are the carbons that make it up. And notice what you see here are lots and lots and lots and lots of carbon and hydrogen bonds. These are energy storing bonds, so you can tell already that a fat has lots of energy. If I were to break these bonds and break them and break them and break them and break them, I'm going to release little bits of energy. In fact, 1 gram of a fat has 9 calories of energy. If you recall, the carbohydrate had 4 calories per gram. So fats contain a lot more energy, twice as much energy per gram as carbohydrates do. The energy storage part comes in this way. If we consume too many calories and our body can't use all those, we tend to process that extra energy and store it as fatty acid chains, like you see here, and then eventually store it as body fat. If you want to lose weight, you have to then convert all of these bonds back into delve in the process right now, but you have to break them all down to release the energy to eventually get rid of the fat. And as you can tell, each fat molecule contains a lot of energy, so it takes a lot of work to break fat down and to get the calories and the energy back out of it. So just wanted to highlight a few other roles. We're going to breeze by these very quickly. Some of the other roles of lipids besides storing energy: air cell membranes depend on lipids. Membranes consist of proteins and lipids, and they make this layer called a phospholipid layer. It's very important to regulate the passage of materials in and out of the cell. Another role of lipids, to form cholesterol. Cholesterol helps maintain the fluidity in animal cell membranes. What that means is it lets the membrane kind of move around and be flexible. So animals use cholesterol to actually keep the membranes fluid and also to synthesize other important hormones from it. So cholesterol is an important molecule that you do have to have. Yes, you can have too much. Your body can actually make too much because all animal cells make cholesterol. So you may actually genetically make too much, or you may consume too much. You may consume a lot of foods that are high in cholesterol, and that's why your cholesterol levels are elevated. So if you go for a physical, they're going to check your cholesterol level to make sure you don't have too much cholesterol in your bloodstream. And they also look at good and bad cholesterol, so we won't delve into that here. The short version of all of this is you do have to have cholesterol because it does have some roles in the body, including keeping your membranes fluid and movable and allow you to make hormones. One of those hormone groups that uses these are steroids. Steroids are these sort of bent-looking molecules. Cholesterol is a kind of steroid. And there's many different roles, including the formation of estrogen and testosterone, sex hormones. And if you look at these molecules very carefully, you'll see there's not a lot of difference between estrogen and testosterone, which is either kind of cool or kind of scary, depending on your perspective. I'm going to end the part here talking about lipids with your body has to have different kinds of fats. You consume fats of different types, saturated versus unsaturated, and your unsaturated fats are going to consist of what are called trans fats or healthy fats. We won't get too detailed here, but I wanted you to see a little bit of the difference in these because you hear about this a lot in the news. Saturated fats are fats that have no double bonds. And notice how we're talking about the bonds that are actually existing in here that join carbon and hydrogens. Notice how nice and straight all of these fatty acid chains are. If you were to try to draw these together, you might draw one fatty acid, one triglyceride like this, another one, because it's all nice and straight, you can pack these very tightly together. And in fact, saturated fats tend to pack together and tend to be solid at room temperature. You can also imagine from a body's perspective, if you're trying to break this down, as you can tell, if it's really tightly bound together, it's more difficult to break down. And we have found a link between people who eat a lot of saturated fat in their diet and higher rates of colon cancer. It could be because by the time these still not completely broken down saturated fats get to your large intestine, some chemical processes occur which influence colon cancer, which influence the cells of the colon to perhaps start down a colon cancer pathway. So saturated fats are those that have no double bonds, so the fatty acids are nice and straight. They tend to bind together very tightly, and therefore that makes them more difficult to digest. Here is just showing you the difference between saturated and unsaturated. Once again, you see the saturated ones, you see how nice and straight these fatty acid chains are, so it tends to bind together very tightly and form this hard fat at room temperature. Unsaturated, and it gets into what are called the double bonds. The more double bonds you have in a fatty acid chain, the more it kinks or bends. So you see how these are kinked a little bit. If you have a double bond in here, it doesn't lay flat. It makes the molecule bend, and therefore these don't get as close together. They're not as dense, and if they're not as dense, they tend to be liquid at room temperature. Let me see if I can get rid of this a little bit. No, this doesn't show it on here. It just shows that these fats are going to be solid because they bind together tightly. The oils tend not to be. So we want to have you avoid too many saturated fats in your diet because that does increase your risk of colon cancer, and eat more foods that are unsaturated fats because they're probably healthier. Except for this little thing that's happened over the years where manufacturers of foods realize this. So what they do is they will take a unsaturated fat, like a kind of vegetable oil, for example, and they will add in hydrogen. It's a process called hydrogenation, and they will actually take something that was going to be an oil and they can make it solid, and they'll say, well, it's healthier than the solid fat. And this is called a trans fat. And you've probably heard of trans fats because some people think that they're actually linked to a number of health conditions. So they tend to be quite unhealthy, and you're discouraged from eating too many of them. Unfortunately, what a lot of our processed foods contain are trans fats. If you've ever seen, what's it called? I can't believe it's not butter. Okay, that big crock of butter, I think it is. Okay, if you look at the label, it'll say partially hydrogenated vegetable oil. They took vegetable oil, added just enough stuff to it to make it solid, and added some yellow color to make it seem like it's butter, give it a butter taste, and they say it's healthier. There's a lot of people that suggest that the trans fats are not healthy, and they're trying to have them banned. Oops, hang on, here we go. Okay, so let's move on to proteins, and then we'll wrap up here in just a second. Proteins perform a lot of functions in the body. You see the list here. Include transport and defense and movement, and form enzymes and make up structure like your hair and your muscles. You can utilize these for energy, but on the choice of energy molecules to use, these are last. Your body wants to use carbohydrates first, lipids second, and then proteins, because proteins have so many other functions, and to break down protein for energy is not that efficient in the end. You do see that you can get 9 calories per gram like you got with carbohydrates, but again, you'd rather not be breaking down protein structure for energy. It's kind of like you don't want to burn the furniture in your house to keep warm in the winter. Don't burn that. That has other purpose. So the take-home message about proteins to mention, aside from they're really not preferred energy molecules, is to understand a little bit about their structure. Just as carbohydrates had monosaccharides to make the polysaccharide, you have the same thing here in proteins. The monomers, the building blocks, are amino acids. If you chain a bunch of them together, you get the polymer, the big thing, or the protein. So here you see there's 2 single amino acids. They can be joined together, and now we have a longer chain. In this case, we have 2 amino acids joined together, but you can have proteins that can have hundreds of amino acids joined together. You have what joins them together is called a peptide bond. So my next peptide bond would form here and join my next amino acid, then another peptide bond and my next amino acid. And as you see here, there's 20 kinds of amino acids that are going to be kind of the library, if you will. And the order of these amino acids is super, super, super important, because the polypeptide, the protein that forms, is a function of the order of amino acids. You see here, every individual ball is an amino acid. The black lines are the peptide bonds that join them. But once I have that initial chain, kind of that beads, if you will, of amino acids, because they have different chemical properties, they begin to twist and fold. Perhaps, for example, this one here repels that one there. So when this thing begins to fold up, it's going to kind of push it away, and it's going to start to change the shape of that resulting protein. So it is important that you see that the amino acid structure, the amino acid order rather, is critical to if that protein folds up in the right way. So once you have the polypeptide chains, they begin to kind of fold on each other, and ultimately you get a three-dimensional protein that has a very, very, very specific shape. And that is critical to making sure it works. The protein shape is going to be all about its functionality. Here is normal hemoglobin because each of these, and it's hard to see here, each of those little dots represents an amino acid, but the whole glob is the correct shape so that it all fits together for normal hemoglobin. If there's one amino acid that's wrong, one single amino acid is wrong, then the resulting shape is not correct. While this may look very similar, it actually is slightly off, and that changes the hemoglobin inside of these red blood cells. Ultimately, you get some cells that are like this, that are sickle-shaped, and this is the problem in sickle cell anemia. They can't carry oxygen in this sickle cell form very well, and they get lodged in blood vessels. So a single mistake in the amino acid sequence is going to produce this change. So critical that the shapes are right, and it's critical the order of amino acids is right so they fold to the correct shape. Let me move off of here for a second so you can see what that says here. So the protein may not perform if the amino acid sequence isn't correct because it doesn't have the right final shape. Now, you should know where the shape comes from. Yes, you should. I'm going to come over here. Remember where the order of amino acids comes from. It's coded for by the DNA. In the DNA, the particular order of A's and T's and C's and G's that are going to be read in the DNA, these three right here may say that's the amino acid lysine. These three may say that's the amino acid leucine. These three may say that's the amino acid aspartic acid. So the order of amino acids is determined by the DNA sequence. So this is really important to get this, so I'm going to go through this one more time. If this order is correct, then, let me go back. Was I not going back? Okay, hang on. So if this order is correct, then I'm going to get the correct order of amino acids, which are going to fold up into the proper shape. The proper shape is this protein here. Okay, this is the proper shape. This fits together with other proteins if everything is done correctly. Done as in, is the DNA sequence correct? If the DNA sequence is correct, you have the right amino acid sequence. If you have the right amino acid sequence, you have the right shape. If you have the right shape, you have the working protein. If somebody has a mutation to where the shape is not correct, they end up with a mutated form of the protein. So I'm saying all of this because we know nucleic acids are the storage of that information. This is the DNA, of course. RNA is going to help facilitate the production of proteins because from the DNA, we're going to make RNA. From the RNA, we're going to string together the amino acids to make the protein. So that wraps up probably more than you ever wanted to know about the nucleic acids, the carbohydrates, the lipids, and the proteins. However, I want to end on one final slide here, which is to focus once more time on energy. What you see here is the proteins can be broken down by digestion. You eat, you break everything down in your stomach and your small intestines and large intestines. You release the amino acids, and those are used to make proteins. Some of the energy, though, is used to make fuel. Okay, fuel as in chemical energy. The carbohydrates, all the sugars, are going to be broken down. Ultimately, the sugars are going to be primarily used as fuel for energy, for our cell work. The fats, the fatty acid chains and the glycerol are going to be broken down, and ultimately we're going to use those as fuel. So notice the proteins, the carbohydrates, and the fats, these three all spill into energy pathways so that we get the energy we need for the fuel to power our cells. Notice also, if we have too much, if we take in too much energy in the form of too much protein or carbohydrates or fats, we metabolize these into fatty acids and ultimately into body fat. If you want to lose weight, you have to talk the body into taking the body fat, and reversing the process so you use that energy as fuel, and this tends to be hard to do. And that's why it's difficult to lose weight sometimes. For 1 pound of body fat, do you realize how many calories are stored in 1 pound? It actually is 3,500 calories. So if you wanted to lose weight, you'd have to make your body spend 3,500 calories more than it consumed over some period of time for you to lose 1 pound of weight. We'll talk about that more later. The video is long enough. But please understand, we don't really use nucleic acids for fuel very much, but proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, these are the major energy sources for our body. Thank you.